Good evening again. I hope you've enjoyed or continue to enjoy your dinners. We're going to get the program started again. It's my pleasure to bring an exciting part of the program. We are having an interview with the Director of the National Institutes of Health, Dr. Francis Collins. Originally, as you saw in the promotional materials, Wolf Blitzer was going to be here, CNN's Wolf Blitzer, but the shooting in Oregon, he's been called to do a live program at 9 o'clock tonight, so he's not able to be here. But we are thrilled to have a terrific stand-in in Mort Kondracki, who is a former journalist and longtime member of the PAN Board of Directors. Before I ask Mort and Dr. Collins to come up on stage, I do want to take a minute to thank our sponsors. Our dinner circle sponsor is Teva Pharmaceuticals. Benefactor sponsor, Paula and Bruce Robinson. Patron sponsors are Advamed, Jody Allen, GE Healthcare, the Ian and Mimi Rowland Foundation, Denise and Art Katsouris, Lundbeck. Our sponsor level, including Acadia Pharmaceuticals, Adamas Pharmaceuticals, Applied Policy, Wolf and Lynn Blitzer, the Clark Charitable Foundation, Forbes Tate, John and Robin Katsouris, the McKeon Group, Mort and Marguerite Kondracki, Zach Levine and Jennifer Avellino, Eli Lilly, MedStar Georgetown University Hospital, Medtronic, Pharma, UCB, and Verizon. I would also like to thank all the sponsors at the supporter level, the friend level, and our media sponsor, Comcast. So want to give everybody, all our sponsors a round of applause. So once again, I want to thank everybody here for all of your generous support in money, of course, but also the support you give us with your expertise, your friendship, your contacts. It all makes a big difference, and it shows the level of commitment you have to PAN and the power of advocacy. So now a little bit more about our next two guests. Anybody who's been coming to these dinners for any length of time knows Mort Kondracki from PAN, but you probably know him as a former executive editor of Roll Call. Mort's got over 45 years of experience in journalism covering American politics and foreign policy. He is also the author of Saving Millie, Love, Politics, and Parkinson's Disease, published in 2011. And the book is about his late wife, Millie, who lost her battle with Parkinson's disease in 2004. Mort has a new book that was just published, and he handed it to me, and then I handed it to Congressman Upton's wife to look at, and I didn't bring it up here. So Mort will tell you what his new book is about. Sorry, Mort. So Dr. Francis Collins has been the director of the NIH for 6 years now and has overseen the work of the largest funder of biomedical research in the world. He's an accomplished physician and geneticist. Many of you know that Dr. Collins also led the Human Genome Project, which made a number of breakthroughs, including an understanding of human DNA sequencing. As director of the NIH, Dr. Collins has been a strong supporter of increased federal funding for medical research and is deeply involved in the President's Brain Initiative and the Precision Medicine Initiative. So we hope to get his perspective on these topics, and I will now ask you to help me welcome Mort Kondracki and Dr. Francis Collins to the stage.
Are we live here? Can you hear us? Good. Here's the book, Jack Kemp. Jack Kemp, the bleeding heart conservative who changed America. Okay, end of commercial. As Fred Upton referred to, normally this role is taken by Diane Rehm. Diane, unfortunately, couldn't be with us this year, so Wolf was going to take her place. Then Wolf got called away because of the shooting. So you are now, your host is now what my wife would call third team All-American.
But very all-American, Mort. Emphasize that part.
So you wouldn't be here if the government had shut down. Is that
I would
right?
not. If the government had shut, I would be prevented from doing anything other than well, I might be considered, as they say, accepted. That's the term of art, but it means I would have to do only official duties that were necessary to preserve property. And I'm afraid this probably wouldn't meet the definition by the legal eagles who would look at my behavior on October 1st. So yes, if the government had shut down last night, you'd be talking to somebody else.
I'd be. There wouldn't be anybody here. Okay, so of all your many accomplishments, the one that certainly surprised me when I learned about it, and will surprise everybody else, is that you are a great guitarist.
Well, great could be taken with a little bit of interpretive liberty there.
And you link music to scientific issues. I have a hard question for you. If you were going to write a song about Parkinson's disease, what would the title be, and what would the message be?
You know, Mort, usually when I write songs, I'm not good enough to write something from scratch, so I usually take a song that somebody else wrote and then I tinker with it. And considering what your charge is here, I think I might go to a song by Carrie Newcomer, which is called "If Not Now, Tell Me When." And I would write some new verses for that. If we can't cure Parkinson's disease now, would you please tell me when? Why can we not move this forward with all of the energy and all the talent and the creativity of the scientific and medical community and get this done? And right now, we could do that. We're being held back. Well, we could go faster. We're going to talk about that, I bet.
Yes, we will definitely talk about that.
Did I set that up well?
Yes, you did. You did that very well, and it sings. It really it has a lilt to it. I like.
Yeah, the chorus goes, "If not now, tell me when. We may never see this moment of place and time again. If not now, tell me when." Yeah.
Great. So you're in the midst of a 5-year strategic planning process for the National Institutes of Health. Tell us what your vision is for the next 5 years. I mean, where would you like to see the NIH go in that time?
So this is an enormously exciting time for scientific research, and all of our 27 institutes and centers, led by remarkable leaders, have their own strategic plans, and that's good because we have such a diversity of scientific goals that for anybody to try to say you could distill this all into just one umbrella proposal would miss a lot of the opportunities. But still, it's a good idea to have something that looks over the whole landscape and says, where are we trying to go? And in fact, the Congress, in their wisdom, told us that it was about time to see one of those NIH-wide strategic plans, and we'll deliver that in December. And it has a number of parts to it, because you can imagine we're pretty far along now trying to develop this, and it's already been tried out in multiple webinars and council meetings and lots of stakeholder input. We do want to emphasize this virtuous circle of basic science, the foundation of all the success that's ever happened in medical research, that basic science that nobody else will do, that NIH leads, that is the way in which we make breakthroughs, although you can never quite tell which basic discovery is going to lead to which breakthrough. But over time, that is how we make progress. But then that's got a link to treatments and cures, and it's got a link to health promotion and disease prevention. So we have that virtuous circle of those three components, and that'll be a lot of what we talk about in terms of how do we set priorities to make sure that the resources we have are going in that direction, and how are we good stewards of the effort so that every dollar that the Congress gives us is spent in the way that is most representative of those priorities. That's what it's going to be about. I think you'll find it pretty interesting when we get it out there.
So are you gonna prioritize the diseases most curable and focus money on those diseases? Is that the way you're going to do it?
That's a big section, is how do we set priorities? And certainly burden of disease is a big part of that, but it can't be the only part of that, otherwise rare diseases wouldn't get worked on at all. And burden of disease doesn't always match up with scientific opportunity, so you have to kind of factor that in there. And then how do you define burden of disease anyway? Various measures are applied, but they don't all agree with each other. And then how do you count up what it means to actually not just come up with a better treatment for a disease, but actually eradicating a disease for all time? That's something it seems like ought to be a very high priority. So we put all those things into the mix, and then we try, and every week we're doing this at NIH, sitting around the table with those 27 institutes and center directors, trying to figure out what does that mean for how we steer this amazing ship called the National Institutes of Health, the largest supporter of biomedical research in the world. How do we make sure that that ship is on the right course?
So this comes out in December, and what's the unveiling going to be like? I mean, is it a public document that everybody can talk about and stuff?
It will be a public document. We will have a discussion of it as my advisory committee to the director meets in early December, because they are going to really need to look at this and see how they feel about it. And then it will be presented to the Congress according to the deadline that they set for us, which I think means we have to present it by about December 16th.
Okay, I know about documents like this. You're not gonna tell me what's in it. So,
I gave you a
and you
general
should. Yes, you did.
You know.
You did. So, we're the Parkinson's Action Network, of course, and we advocate on behalf of Parkinson's patients and families and their researchers, and we try to boost NIH and so on. What effect does an organization like this have?
An enormous effect. I'm honored to be here with you all this evening. I've been a great admirer of the Parkinson's Action Network over the years. I've come to these events, gosh, back when I was in the Genome Institute, because clearly there were things happening there in terms of the way in which studies of the genome could assist in understanding this disease. You all have a very, very strong reputation of being effective advocates who stand up for the right thing to try to make sure that this disease gets the kind of scientific attention it deserves, but you do so in a very authoritative way. You know your science, you also know your politics, which is a good thing in this town, and you are respected and you are helpful to us in the biggest way. As we'll get to, NIH is really struggling right now. We've had a very bad 12 years in terms of a slide in support. And for me to advocate and say that's a bad thing is one thing, but it probably sounds a little bit self-serving, like, of course, you know, he would say that. For you all to say that and to bring your stories in front of those who make those decisions is so much more powerful, and you do it really well.
So,
You do.
thank you, and we hope everybody will write a big check tonight. but so what could we do that would improve our impact?
I think one of the things, and I think Pan gets this, but not all the advocates do, a message that really needs to be shared is, these days, what we're learning about the nature of illness is that there are connections between conditions that we didn't know before. So much of the way we actually divide up medical diagnoses is based upon historical data that is increasingly not really measuring up with new research. So it would be a mistake, for instance, to suggest that if you want to see Parkinson's cured, you should only put all the money in Parkinson's, because I'll be willing to bet that a lot of the breakthroughs that are needed are going to come from somewhere else that you didn't expect. I just heard at my table a few minutes ago about a drug that was developed for cancer that maybe is showing promise for Parkinson's disease. We have an example of that for Alzheimer's as well. All these pathways that go on in the cell and the individual, they didn't read Harrison's textbook of medicine. They didn't realize that they were supposed to be compartmentalized according to a particular diagnosis. They're all interconnected. So if you want to see the progress that I know you are really hungry to see happen in Parkinson's, it's going to be really important to have the whole enterprise built up. The basic science, the translational science, the clinical studies, but not just for neuroscience even, but across the board, because that's where those inferences are going to come from.
Do you see the disease community, the activists on behalf of cancer and diabetes and Alzheimer's, and Parkinson's working together at the moment, or are they, because of budget limitations, fighting each other for every dollar?
I think mostly working together, because I think what I just said about the importance scientifically of those connections.
So they get it.
Has been, but not everybody's gotten that. And of course, when things get really tight, and they are really tight right now, it tends to promote the idea that you just got to go and push for your own circumstance and not worry too much about the rest, which would be the worst thing we could do right now. This organization has not made that mistake, but there are instances, I think, in this town where that mistake has been made.
Right. Well, let me ask you some specific Parkinson's questions. So when my late wife, Millie, was diagnosed with Parkinson's, the neurologist who diagnosed her said, well, if you're going to get any neurological disease at all, and it's too bad that you got this, Parkinson's is the one to get because we're going to cure it in 5 years. That was 1987. So how much closer have we gotten in that time?
Well, I'm sobered to hear that story, Mort, because clearly in 1987 that was wildly optimistic in terms of what we knew at that point. And it would be wildly optimistic, I think, now for anybody to put a timetable on what it's going to take, because science doesn't follow those timetables. Science is not that predictable. Only thing I can say is if we put more resources into it, it'll come sooner instead of later. But I don't know what that time scale will look like, because I don't have a crystal ball about the insight that might be ready to happen next week or next year that's going to suddenly move us in that direction. We have learned an awful lot about Parkinson's disease. Goodness, since 1987. I'm thinking back, I was part of the conversation that happened with Bob Nussbaum and Mikhail Polymeropoulos in the Genome Institute in the mid-1990s about maybe we could actually discover that there are genetic factors in Parkinson's if you study those rare families like the one in Greece where it seems to be getting inherited in a dominant fashion. And out of that came the discovery of alpha-synuclein. Alpha-synuclein, this protein, which is the main protein in the Lewy bodies that you see in the neurons in the part of the brain that's affected in Parkinson's disease. That was a huge step forward. Up until then, you could describe them in the microscope. You didn't know what was going on there. Now we know. In fact, we know now that Parkinson's disease joins a list of other conditions, including Alzheimer's, including Lou Gehrig's disease, including frontotemporal dementia, including Huntington's disease, where there are proteins that deposit in these insoluble aggregates in neurons and ultimately cause the death of those neurons. So there's a common theme in that whole mechanism, which suggests maybe there could be a common intervention that would work for all those conditions.
But we haven't found it.
We have not found it yet, but believe me, that is the enormously exciting opportunity that many neuroscientists are now looking at.
So a dear friend of mine was just diagnosed with MS. And as a matter of fact, Ted Thompson used to work for the MS Society and referred her to some of the best MS doctors in the country. And it turns out that in the case of MS, they have actually discovered medicines that will retard the progress of the disease. Now, there are lots of treatments for Parkinson's, for symptoms and stuff like that. Nothing retards the disease. Now, is this a scientific difference, or is this a money difference? How come there's more progress on MS than there is in Parkinson's?
Yeah, it's a good question. But MS is such a different condition in terms of what's going on in the body. This is an autoimmune disease. And the immune system, which we are beginning to understand, has sort of pressure points that you can apply to try to ratchet the whole system down when it's overactive, as it is in MS. And that's been taken advantage of by those developments. Parkinson's doesn't give you the same ability to move a dial the way that MS does. So it's mostly a scientific difference. But again, I would say we could be going faster on MS also, and we could certainly be going faster on Parkinson's if we weren't at the current moment limited by resources.
Right. So the National Institute of Neurological Disorders and Stroke, NINDS, which is our institute, has 31 priorities that are under development for PD research. So what's gonna flow from that?
Oh, a lot. And I should recognize somewhere in there, in the middle of the room, is Dr. Walter Koroshetz, who's the director of NINDS. Walter, would you stand up? You will never meet a more experienced neurologist or a more committed human being for the cause of neurological diseases, including Parkinson's, than my friend Walter. And I'm really delighted that he accepted this opportunity. So those 31 list of priorities developed last year in a very extensive process outline a whole host, from basic through clinical, of things that now can be done to try to ultimately cure this disease. That includes such things as trying to understand the genetic contributions. I mentioned alpha-synuclein, but now we know about 28 genetic variations that increase the risk of this disease. And they're telling us something really important about the pathways that are involved, and that in turn points you to ideas about treatment that you wouldn't have guessed at before. That's pretty exciting. We have the opportunity to use this whole revolution in understanding stem cells, where you can, in fact, take a skin biopsy from somebody with Parkinson's disease. You can convince those cells to go back in time and become like an embryo, pluripotent, and then you can differentiate them into neurons, dopamine-making neurons even, and see how are they different than the same kinds of cells you got from somebody who doesn't have the disease. And then you've got, in a Petri dish, the opportunity to study this disease in a very intimate way that you could never do in living human beings. That's pretty exciting. We haven't fully figured out how to exploit it, but goodness, a few years ago, that would have been considered utter science fiction. We have clinical trial opportunities, which are already happening now. This observation that people who have higher levels of uric acid, the thing that causes gout if it goes really high, but guess what? If it goes high, your risk of Parkinson's is actually reduced. Well, that's interesting, and it suggests a drug treatment, inosine, which is currently being tried in a trial. We have other things. There's an idea that maybe there's a problem with calcium flux in the neurons in the substantia nigra, the part of the brain where Parkinson strikes, and that maybe you could inhibit that with a hypertension drug that affects that pathway. It's another example of this repurposing of drugs that were developed for something totally different, and maybe they would work in this space. Another reason not to get too narrow-minded. That's underway. And there are things like exercise and what role that can play in terms of maintaining function. But I will tell you, I would not say right now we are on the brink of starting a clinical trial with something that we're absolutely convinced is going to be it. And that's what we have to push really hard, from the basic through the translational, cutting back on the very long timetables that unfortunately are in place. And we're very determined to figure out ways to do that too.
Right. So right now there is on the order of, depending on which year and which congressional budget cycle we're in, 150, it was $150 million being spent on Parkinson's, then it went down to 134 million, I think, and now it's back up to 140. How much could you usefully spend on Parkinson's?
Well, when you look at what's happened to people who have great ideas and come to NIH seeking support for those ideas, do you know what your chance is today if you send in your grant to the National Institutes of Health that it's actually going to get supported? It's about 16%. For most of the last half century, it's been about 30%. We're leaving half the great science on the table. And that's for Parkinson's, that's for cancer, that's for diabetes, that's for autism, that's for all those things. That is my greatest source of distress. And it is doing serious damage to the talent that ought to be out there pushing back the frontiers and who is instead getting demoralized, and many of the younger scientists really beginning to think about whether they should do something else. So how much would
you say 300 million or what? putting you in the hot seat.
He's
Double
leading
it?
the witness.
That would raise the pay level to 32%. I mean, is 50% the right? What percentage of the good research ought to get funded any year for any disease?
Yeah, I think from our experience, a third is about right. If you had 30 to 35% success rates, you would be funding the really good stuff. We don't want to fund 100%. We're tough. We don't want things coming in the door that aren't well thought through and just throwing money at it. But we're right now so far away from that. If we could double the current success rates, that would be fantastic.
So let's go to the budget issue. I mean, the United States has always been the world's leader in biomedical research. I mean, the NIH is still the biggest funder, made possible your decoding of the genome process. Yet for a decade, the last decade, I think the after inflation value of the money being spent on at NIH is down by 25%. Is that right?
That's right.
Okay.
Can you imagine? Over 12 years, we have lost almost a quarter of the purchasing power for research just at the moment where the scientific opportunities are so exciting. It's so peculiar and paradoxical, and it is completely different from the rest of the world. Mort, I am serving as the chair right now of something called the Heads of International Research Organizations. It's an informal group that gets together twice a year somewhere in the world. Around that table are the CEOs of the government and philanthropy foundations that support 95% of public medical research. No staff, just the CEOs. And we go around the table and everybody says what they're planning to do the following year. And China's going to go up by 15%, and that wasn't such a good year. It was 20 the year before. And Singapore is going to do this, and Korea is going to do that, and Brazil's ramping up, and Canada and the UK and Europe, even despite their economic woes, they're continuing to push medical research because they see this as the most important investment. And they come to me. And I have to say, well, if we're lucky, we won't lose more than 2 or 3% of our purchasing power next year. And they look at me like, what happened? We're following your playbook. America led this effort. We saw what you did in the 80s and 90s. We want to be you. Have you forgotten how to be you?
So I mean, Fred Upton was in the lead. I remember I was around when the NIH budget was doubled by Bill Clinton had started, and Fred Upton and George W. Bush continued it and finished it out. All of a sudden it stopped. What happened?
I think maybe there was a sense that wonderful doubling, and Fred deserves a huge amount of the credit for making that happen in a truly bipartisan way. John Porter was in there pitching, lots of people on both sides of the aisle. This was a shared sense of vision. But we got to 2003, our country got into some fiscal challenges. The deficit began to be a big concern, and you can understand why. And basically, maybe it was sort of like, well, we took care of NIH. They should be okay now. And for a little while, that was true. But after 12 years, losing year by year, and then the sequester kicking in and causing us to lose on one day in March of 2013, $1.55 billion disappearing from the medical research budget, 600 grants that were about to get funded that weren't. Who knows which of those might have been the next breakthrough in Parkinson's disease? I don't know. They're gone. All on the basis of what everybody agreed was the most mind-numbingly stupid way to manage a budget, which is this sequestration model where you just cut everything across the board and assume that's right. But I gotta say, I am so heartened, and I'm so glad you're here recognizing Fred.
I was going to ask you about
and
Fred.
recognizing Diana, because they're trying to turn that corner.
Okay, so if the 21st Century Cures initiative that Fred and Diane have passed through the House, gets passed by the Senate
by a major majority.
What kind of difference will that make?
Profoundly. The idea that over the next 5 years, if this goes all the way through the Senate and gets signed into law, $8.75 billion being added to the NIH budget would be such a shot in the arm.
So what percentage increase is that?
Well, if you spread it out over each of those years, you're talking about something like $1.7 billion, recognizing that our current budget is about in the range of 30. You're talking about 5%. As an increase, we haven't had that since 2002. And for the scientific community that is so disheartened and increasingly seeing no evidence that things are ever going to get better and therefore beginning to leave the field, this would be a turning point. This would make America back on a path that we could be confident was going to get where we need to go. So thank you, Fred.
So Fred actually planted this question, but within the 21st Century Initiatives, Cures Initiative, there is an innovation fund,
That's
right?
the Senate side.
It's in the Senate side. It's
Well,
not in his bill?
I'm sorry, the Innovation Fund is what we were just talking about, the
yeah.
8.75 billion. Yes.
Okay, so I thought that that was separate, that this was a pot of money that you could actually spend on your priorities, right?
Gotcha. Right. So I'm sorry. I'm misidentifying the terminology here. Yes. And in
I
fact,
may, you know, I'm a journalist. I can get things confused. Go ahead.
you're not the only one. No, this is intended not just to be something that gets frittered out in all sorts of directions, but actually has the opportunity to inspire people to take risks, to do research that they might otherwise think, oh, in the tough peer review situation we're in right now, it probably won't get funded. Now we want them to do that. We want people to be pursuing ideas that are a little bit wacky, but if they happen to work, you've got a breakthrough. We haven't had enough of that. It's been too constraining. This would turn that around.
Right. Okay, so the president announced a brain initiative in April of 2013. Everybody said, you know, that the brain is the last frontier, or that in space probably, or maybe the deep earth. I don't know what the last frontier is, but it's one of the great last frontiers. What difference is that making at NIH, and what difference will it make for Parkinson's?
Well, this audience, I'm sure, has been watching that closely because I think the brain is, in many ways, the most complicated and in many ways most challenging of all biomedical research projects you could possibly imagine. We have 86 billion neurons in between your ears, and each one of those has maybe 1,000 connections. So maybe we're being audacious to imagine that we could mount a project that would actually understand how those circuits work. But it's time. It's time. But it wouldn't happen just bits and pieces, the path we were on. It was time to bring together the kind of disciplines that haven't always talked to each other the way that we want them to now. The people who know engineering, the people who know nanotechnology, the people who know robotics, the people who know computer science, the people who know imaging, the physicians, the neuroscientists, and say, okay, we're going to do something really radical here. We're going to put out opportunities to develop the kind of technology that we don't have right now that can actually understand how the circuits in the brain are doing the amazing things they do. Not just a snapshot of a still picture, but a movie. How is the brain working? And not just a neuron here and a neuron there, but millions of neurons at once. How do they, in fact, initiate a motor movement? How do they process visual information? How do they lay down a memory and retrieve it? We have the chance to figure that out. This is bold. Some people said our brains aren't complicated enough to understand our brains. I don't agree. We may need a little computer help along the way. But to come to your question about Parkinson's, this will be foundational for anybody who's interested in unraveling at a deep level the mystery of a brain disease. You want to know, what's the foundation you're working with? What's the normal way the brain works? And if we had that information right now, I think we'd be much further along with Parkinson's, with autism, with epilepsy, with traumatic brain injury, with schizophrenia, with bipolar disease, all these illnesses that we're really desperately looking for answers, and we should. But at the same time, let's build that foundation, and let's see where that takes us.
Well, we've got to stop. Ted refuses to give me the time to ask you about theology, which I was going to. No kidding. I mean, he is a theologian. He wrote a book called The Language of God and 2 other books about the link between science and faith, but we don't have time to do that. All we can tell you is the Parkinson's Action Network has your back. And more than that, it will advocate for you as strongly as we can. So thank you so much.
Thank you,
I really
all of you.
appreciate it.
Mort, that was great.
Thank you. So I'm not Diane Rehm anymore or Wolf Blitzer. I'm back to being Mort Kondracki. I'm a board member of the of PAN for life, I guess, and I've been co-chair of the dinner with Diane Rehm for a lot of years, and I got involved in this, as you could tell from the questioning, because my late wife Millie had Parkinson's and died as a result. But she was one of the earliest advocates. As a matter of fact, she and Joan Samuelson, who was the founder of the Parkinson's Action Network, and Ann Udall, who was Mo Udall's daughter, who is Mo Udall's daughter, were PAN at the very beginning, and they were a mighty team of advocates. So we created the Millie Award, which honors the most successful, energetic, and dedicated advocates out there in the country. And this year, we give the award to somebody who embodies Millie's spirit profoundly. Tonight's recipient is Roger Helene. He's the primary caregiver for his wife, Barbara, who was diagnosed with Parkinson's in 2008. And since then, he's been the Illinois State Director for PAN. He's forged important relationships with his members of Congress. He's organized awareness and fundraising events in his community, and through it all has brought a humility and grace to his work that is often hard to find. So, Roger, is Roger here with us tonight or not? He is, okay. Roger, thank you. So, of course you're here with us tonight. So this is the Millie Award, and the person who could not be here tonight is your Senator Mark Kirk, who is a good supporter of ours, and he sent this letter to you congratulating you. So thank you very much for all of your work. I really appreciate it. Thank you. Okay.
Well, first of all, I have to admit that I am truly honored to receive this award. Been involved in PAN for 6 years, I think now. I have looked up to everyone that has received this award and never ever considered myself worthy of it. So I want to start out first by thanking PAN and the PAN staff. I'm sure everybody in this room knows that we face a lot of obstacles on Capitol Hill as far as advocacy goes, and the PAN staff is there for us all the way. Never have I sent them an email, called them on the phone, asked for help, gotten help within maybe minutes sometimes. Some of them have even emailed me back in the evenings and on the weekends. They are an outstanding group of people that work for the advocates out here in Washington, D.C. The second person that I want to thank tonight is my wife. She stands behind me on everything I do. I won't say she always agrees with everything I do, and sometimes she says I'm overcommitted, but down deep and in her heart, she stands for everything that I do, and she's always there with me, whether it's a PAN event, an APDA event, a support group event, or any of my other hobbies that I'm sure she'd love to complain to you about tonight. I'm often asked why. Why do I do this? People at work, other people I know, they say, look at what we face in government today. Why? Why get involved? Well, I think you've heard tonight from a number of people on the 21st Century Cure, the funding issues that the National Institute of Health has. Those are some issues that I believe firmly will help people like my wife, people in the whole Parkinson's community. And I believe firmly that we need advocates to stand behind and get behind and help push to accomplish something. One of the other reasons I do it is I was fortunate enough to attend my first PAN forum, which I think is a wonderful event. PAN brings us out here for a couple days of advocacy training, and then they send us to Capitol Hill for a day. I was fortunate enough to attend that. I believe it was in 2009, about 2 years after my wife's diagnosis. I don't have Parkinson's, and I was dead at the end of that day. Yet I watched about 200 people that day travel the halls of Congress, knocking on their senators and their representatives' doors. I saw them with their issues with Parkinson's that they deal with every day. And they didn't give up. They still made it. Some of the groups made it to all of their representatives and all of their senators in the same day. And that was something that just impressed me because I like to consider myself as somebody in fairly good shape. And I had just spent about 8 hours walking the halls of Capitol Hill. And let me tell you, I was dead. I don't understand how those people with Parkinson's do it. And I said from that point on, I'm going to support PAN. I'm going to support their forum. And it's been a journey ever since then. And since Haley told me I had 3 minutes, and I'm sure she's standing someplace close with her shepherd's crook, and we're all looking forward to dessert, I will just once again say thank you to PAN and thank you to everyone in this room that is supporting PAN.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. What a beautiful venue and special evening we're having. Thank you all for being here. And I'm going to go off notes for just a moment. We all know, anybody who's put together an event like this, how many people it takes and all the details that go behind the scenes. And I noticed on our agenda that there really isn't a thank you. So I'd like to personally have all of us thank and clap for Ted and the PAN Network, and especially all the staff people who have put this wonderful event together for us. Thank you. My name is Robin Katsaris, and I'm a proud and very privileged member of the PAN Board of Directors. I'm also an assistant state director for PAN in California, and I'm the caregiver for my husband, John, who has Parkinson's and was diagnosed in 2008. He is here tonight with me. You, John, are the reason I do what I do. It is my true pleasure to introduce to you a remarkable advocate. Brian Soma received his diagnosis at the age of 33. Instead of giving up, he decided to become a PAN advocate. However, he needed the education and the training that the forum provides, and he just couldn't afford it. For those of you who don't know what the forum is, it's the only national gathering of people affected by Parkinson's to advocate for better treatments and a cure. And I'd like to report that we are the only advocacy organization. I'd just like to repeat that. We are the only one with a unified voice. It's not as sexy as research, and it sometimes can be rather mundane, but it is vitally important to this community, the work that the PAN advocates do. Hundreds of people living with Parkinson's, as well as caregivers and health and policy professionals, attend the forum. They learn the latest in policy and research. They network with each other. They speak to members of Congress about what they can do to enhance the lives of those living with Parkinson's. And in fact, PAN is the single reason I got involved in advocacy when I attended my very first forum almost probably 7 years ago. When Brian was informed that he had been awarded a full scholarship, he immediately started to fundraise to cover the cost of his trip. But he didn't stop there. Using social media business connections, family, and friends, Brian went on to not only pay for his own trip, but raised enough money for 6 other advocates to attend. Let's hear more from this terrific young man. It is my privilege and honor to welcome Brian Soma.
I know it's getting late, so I'll keep my remarks to just a few hours. Good evening. You might be wondering what these pins are. Yes, this is the Chinese character for crisis. John Kennedy famously said in a speech in 1959, in the Chinese language, the word for crisis is composed of 2 characters. The first representing danger, but the second, opportunity. Now, I'd like you to think of the last time you had a crisis. Perhaps you felt vulnerable, worried for yourself or your family, even scared. I know how that feels. I had a crisis about 2 years ago. You see, I had a tremor that wouldn't go away. At the time, I was the vice president of a retail company. And naturally, I assumed I was drinking too much coffee, which I was. But it turns out that too much caffeine wasn't causing my shaking. In June of 2013, I went to a neurologist. Over the course of several months, and after a long battery of expensive tests, my doctor looked at me and said, "Brian, you've got Parkinson's disease." I told him I want a second opinion. He said, "Okay, you should lose some weight too." But I did eventually get a second opinion, and a third, and a fourth. You see, I didn't want to acknowledge that I was having a crisis. And by the time I accepted it, I was knee-deep in crisis. For over a year, I floundered with no direction, no purpose. I had drawn the painful conclusion that my life, my usefulness on this earth, had ended with that diagnosis. I was 33 years old. Then late last year, I spoke to Haley Carpenter from the Parkinson's Action Network. Thank you, Haley. She informed me that I had been awarded a scholarship to attend the PAN Forum here in DC. I was being given the opportunity to tell my story to Congress and help fight for an increase in Parkinson's funding. For me, this trip at the time was prohibitively costly. But at some point, someone somewhere, perhaps one of you in the audience tonight, donated to PAN and gave me much more than a plane ticket. Now, there are people who perhaps don't believe that their donation can give renewed hope to people who have none. And I know sometimes it's difficult to see the connection between altruistic giving and the end result of that benevolence. Ladies and gentlemen, I am an end result. And when I spoke to members of Congress during the forum, I was only able to do so because of you. And now, more than ever, I believe that the most effective way to change government policy is to speak to your elected officials and tell your story. I know firsthand how the Parkinson's Action Network can change a life, because it changed mine. But a crisis is still looming, ladies and gentlemen. Since this morning, approximately 164 more Americans have been diagnosed with Parkinson's. 164 Americans like me, like you, like your children and parents. This is indeed a crisis. It is a danger that has crept its way into all of our lives. But in every crisis, there is an opportunity. On your tables are pledge cards. I'd like you to grab one now if, like me, you made it through your crisis with the help of others. Tonight, ladies and gentlemen, is your chance to pay it forward. Your chance to make a donation to support the scholarship program for the 2016 Forum in February. In just a few minutes, there will be volunteers walking around who will take your completed cards. But just think for a moment. For $10,000, you can sponsor the entire delegation from New Jersey or Georgia. For $5,000, you could sponsor the entire delegation from states like Indiana or Idaho. I learned so much about myself and my disease at the Forum. It truly changed my life. Won't you give that opportunity to another person? For $1,900, you can. You could sponsor one full scholarship, which includes airfare, hotel, and registration. I'd love to be able to tell 10 good advocates that good people here tonight will sponsor them. Please, pick up a card, fill it out, and be as generous as you can be. Parkinson's disease is a great crisis, a great danger, but this is your great opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian, for sharing your journey and for becoming a fierce advocate. And he doesn't toot his own horn for what he's done, but I checked his personal fundraising page this morning because he reposted it from the airport on his way out here. And he's already raised over $2,100 to fund other people's scholarships. So Brian, not only talks the talk, he walks the walk. So we so appreciate what you do, Brian. So we're about to wrap up, but please continue to fill out your cards. Staff are walking around to collect them. I want to take a minute to also acknowledge the work of our board of directors. Thank you for everything you do. The staff work tirelessly. They're tremendously committed individuals. And I will announce, if you haven't heard yet, that Haley Carpenter, after 9 years, is moving on to another organization, and we greatly appreciate everything Haley has done for PAN through the years. Thank you to the board members that are rotating off the board and the new board members and officers that have stepped up to be part of the board. So on behalf of the entire PAN Board of Directors, the staff, the advocates, the hundreds of grassroots leaders, the thousands of activists that we have around the country, thank you for being here tonight. Please enjoy the dessert reception and have a safe trip home. Good night.